Okay. So welcome to this webinar on how to use stories to catalyze both individual and organizational change. I'm David Lee, and this is...
I'm Susanne Evans. Nice to meet you.
So I thought I'd start us off with a story about how Susanne and I met. And it's actually a great example of both how simple storytelling can be about capturing stories just from everyday life, because this is a story that I'll share with career coaching clients that I'm working with who have a negative view of networking, and they think it's some schmoozy, slimy kind of thing where you're using people to advance your career, as opposed to a great way of connecting with interesting people. So I don't know, 6 to 8 months ago, I posted an article on LinkedIn on storytelling. It was a Harvard Business Review article. And I noticed a really cool comment from a certain Suzanne Brown, Dr. Suzanne Brown. And like, oh, I noticed that she's, so I went to her LinkedIn profile. I noticed that she was into storytelling. So I thought, I'm just going to reach out. So I did a LinkedIn connection request, and also said, it looks like you're doing some really interesting stuff. It would be fun sometime if you want to do like a video chat. So Suzanne said, sure. Had a really fun, at least it was to me,
It was
fun,
fun. It was definitely fun.
a fun conversation. And then, I don't know, a month or two later, Suzanne was she was in the process of recording a new podcast series and asked if I wanted to be on it. I was on it. It was on storytelling. We had a great time. And then we were doing just a catch-up Zoom meeting, I don't know, a month or two ago. And I thought, like, wouldn't it be fun to do some sort of collaboration? Because just really enjoy our
And here we
conversations.
are.
Yeah, and here we are. So that's how we met. And that's a simple example of using a simple everyday experience as a story. So again, I use that story with coaching clients about, hey, connect with people around topics that interest you. So when you do reach out, you have some sincere interest in making that connection. And then when you do talk with them, you're not just trying to make up conversation and have that dreaded cocktail hour, like, so that it's an animated, fun conversation. So Suzanne, do you want to start us off with what got you into storytelling?
Yeah, and actually, this is a story that I tell quite a lot too. So when I'm trying to explain to people about the work that I do and how I ended up doing it, and why a big part of my work is about doing change differently, organizational change differently, and why they need to think about doing it differently. This is the story that I tell. So 20 years ago, I was working for a Big Four consultancy firm, working on some really big change programs in lots of different organizations. But what struck me was every organization seemed to find change hard. And it didn't seem to matter how many people they had working on the project, what tools and techniques they were using. It still was difficult, and leaders were frustrated, employees were losing engagement. The consultants that I was working with were tired and frustrated, working really long hours it was like pushing a rock up a hill, trying to create this change. And I thought back then, there must be a different way of doing this, but I didn't know what it was. So fast forward 10 years from that point, I'd left Big Four and I'd gone out on my own, and my intention was to do the work that I loved, but to do it differently. And I still didn't really know how, but I was working on a project in an organization, and they were rolling out a huge vision, a completely different way of working. And they had got in some consultants to work with them to teach the leaders how to tell the story of this change. So they were moving from, the typical leadership briefing of, usually man, stands up with slides, presents slides, everyone goes home, to something where they were given the slides, they were given the leaders were given the stuff to use, but then they made it into a story based on their own experience. And they went away for 2 days, this board, to learn how to do that, and to learn about story, and to tell their story, and to get feedback from each other on how that story was. And just by virtue of the job I was doing, this consultancy piece of work, I went along to this workshop, and it was like, wow, this is amazing. And the difference was huge. The difference in these people, in the way that they were talking. Then when they went back into the business, the way that it landed, the communication, the engagement was just phenomenal. So I thought, maybe there's something in this storytelling business. So this was 8 years ago. And then I started to research it, started to talk to different people about it, about, storytelling, how it works and how it links into change. And then as a result of that, I did some research of my own, which led me to get a PhD in organizational change and storytelling, which kind of led me here. So now I use this stuff with my work all the time. But it was almost like a series of moments that could have gone in a different way, but kind of led me down this path.
Neat. And when you say how differently it landed versus, the typical PowerPoint slide, metrics, et cetera, what did you notice in the audience?
I think there was like a ripple of excitement when they were talking about this, because the way that they discussed it was very much around what this meant to them. So me personally, me as head of this department, this is what's coming. This is what I think, this is why it's happening. This is what it means to me. This is why I'm excited about it. And it, it wasn't as though nobody disagreed, or everyone thought it was a terrific idea, but it was like, it was that more excitement and engagement. And where there was, I hesitate to use the word resistance because I don't really like it, but where there was differing opinions, it was done in a more constructive way. I've seen some real horror stories of change resistance, which maybe we'll go into another time, but things going wrong, and this wasn't like that. So this was a fundamental change to the business, but people were excited about it, and that was something I hadn't seen before, which I guess is what piqued my interest about the use of story.
Neat. And your mention about people being excited makes me think about a real seminal moment for me around storytelling that I want to share in a second. But before I do, I just want to put our conversation in the context that we had talked about ahead of time, so viewers kind of get a sense of where we're going. And so our first piece, which you might be noticing, is why storytelling. And so we're going to talk a little more about why we're such fans of storytelling, why use that versus non-storytelling approaches. And then one of the things that Susanne and I talked about were some of the misconceptions people have about storytelling, which keeps them from using this incredibly useful modality. Then we'll talk about a few applications around like where and why and when would you use stories to facilitate change. And then we'll end off with how can you become a story catcher, like notice stories as they're unfolding. For me, the first thing I'll share, and then I'll share the one around excitement, is the power of story one-on-one. In that my first career was as an addictions counselor, and I had been trained in a very direct, sometimes confrontational approach, even though that's not who I am by nature, in terms of like, you've got a drinking problem, you've got a substance abuse problem. And as a naive new grad, I thought my clients would thank me for saving their lives with this epiphany. Not only did they not thank me, they never showed up again, over and over and over. And so rather than, well, at first I would just blame them. They were in denial. And you think about it, how often when people don't respond the way we want them to respond, we blame them. And that felt pretty good, except my calendar was wide open. So I had to do something other than just blame them. And I stumbled upon an intensive training program on therapeutic storytelling. Totally transformed my work to where instead of clients feeling defensive because I was directly confronting them, I would tell them stories. And one of the powers of storytelling in terms of challenging people's perceptions, beliefs, etc., is that because it's, quote, just a story, there's nothing to defend against. It's not directly like pointing the finger at them. And I won't go into this, some stories around that, but that's one piece. But the story that I want to quickly share with you that relates to what Susanne, that you were saying with the excitement, that this happened, I think it was in 1992, but it feels like it was yesterday. So my second career was in the mind body medicine field. So I practiced hypnosis, therapeutic storytelling, and I was speaking at a mind body medicine conference, and one of the keynote speakers was this icon in the mind body medicine field. And he's doing his keynote, and it's after lunch. And anybody who's done after lunch talks exactly knows how fun that is. And so he's a very powerful person with a very powerful presence. But what's happening is he's sort of haranguing the audience with bullet point takeaways about how important it is to see patients as individuals and not as illness and this and that and that. And he was so passionate about his message. But I'm looking around this audience of over 1,000 people, and I can see, and they're feeling like I am, like I'm just lapsing into a coma. I'm like sliding down into my seat and fading. And it was interesting. I don't know if he picked up on this and he's like, okay, plan B, or it was just part of what was coming next. Is he said something like, let me give you an example of a woman I worked with. And as soon as he said that, I felt like I was rising from the dead. I like came back up into, and I looked around and I could feel the energy of the audience rise. And he's telling, there's the drama, the the poignancy, the pathos, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, that's storytelling. That's why you tell stories.
Gosh, I love that. And I wonder whether it was deliberate, or whether, I mean, you like to think he read the room and decided to change. Let's say that's what happened. But it's and you know, I've been in that situation myself as a participant, and also as a, you know, as a trainer, and it does just have that effect on people, because it instantly people are interested, because it's something meaningful and something relatable. I think that's what makes all the difference with it.
I'm glad you mentioned that term relatable, because that's part of why when if you read articles on storytelling, you'll oftentimes hear people write, the human brain was hardwired for storytelling. And you think about it, that if you hear a story, it's much more relatable. It's because it's so concrete and tangible. And so you're not trying to process abstract terminology into like your own experience, because a story well told creates an experience. I was thinking this morning as I was preparing for our conversation, I was thinking it's sort of like the difference between reading a recipe and eating a meal. Very different experience. Or if somebody tells, did you ever see Jurassic Park?
Yes.
Okay, so if somebody says, "Ah, back when it was a new movie, you should see the movie. It's like so cool. There's like dinosaurs and stuff." You're like, okay. It doesn't do anywhere near capturing if you actually watch it and you're feeling the drama unfold and you're seeing the imagery, et cetera, et cetera. And so stories are so much more relatable and therefore engaging.
Do you think, thinking about your example of Jurassic Park, I think that's part of the reason why people get a bit afraid that they can't tell stories, because when they think about a story, they think about a movie or a book or something like that that they've seen, which is you know, such a huge story in itself. You know, a 2 hour long film is a sort of an arc of the story. And I think that's one of the reasons why people get a bit afraid of using them, because they think they have to be like, you know, George Lucas or Steven Spielberg. And actually, I don't think that's the case. I don't think you do either.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And that's actually a great segue into that next piece about like common myths around storytelling, why not to be afraid of the storytelling. Yeah. So it's the way I think about it, a couple different. So no, we're not talking about story as performance or performing art. We're talking about stuff that you already do. Let's say you come off of a vacation and like something really interesting happened, or you had somebody told you something funny and you share it with a friend, or just simple experiences like you and I have just shared, real life, simple real life experiences, and thinking about, how could I use this thing that was sort of interesting or was very interesting or caught me off guard? How could I use this as an illustration or, some kind of teaching story? And so one of the things, like for me, since a lot of the work that I do is on how to have courageous conversations, is I will pay really close attention to my internal world when I'm getting ready to have a hard conversation. What are my fears? What's my little self-talk, etc.? How I talk myself into having the conversation, how I plan for it, what happened in the conversation, etc. And then I take notes sometimes right after. So it's like I can now use this experience as a story. So yeah, it's not some big mythic movie kind of story or stage performance story. What are some of the other things you think about when people say, oh, I don't know if I can do that?
I think it's similar, really, and I think it's helping people think about how to structure a story. So if they want to tell a particular story, so I do quite a lot of work with people who are small business owners and they want to get more clients or they want to get some funding, and so they have to be able to tell a compelling story about their business. And I think that can feel quite difficult for people, because they all have, there's a passion, isn't there? You know, those of us who own a small business, there's a passion behind it. But how do you get that across in a way that makes sense and is going to make people want to buy your products or service or invest in you? And I think the first thing is helping people think about a structure. So if you're creating a story from scratch, it's quite useful sometimes to think about the structure, but not to be too wedded by that. But basically, you know, it has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You know, it has to have some people in it, because that's what people like, a character. And it could be you, it could be other people. And if you think about a film or a book, there has to be some kind of emotion. So it's not, otherwise it's just fact. You know, I set up the business in 1982. You know, it's more than that. It's a set of emotion. I mean, people love a story that's like a roller coaster, or that sort of thing. And I think that can help people if they're nervous about writing a story or telling a story. Having that sort of structure to hang stuff off can really help. But like you, I think it's about being authentic and telling something that's meaningful to you, that you think is relevant to the situation that you find yourself in. It can be useful sometimes to preface it by saying, let me tell you a story to explain what I mean, and that gets people in the mood for hearing a story. But I think it is really important to kind of break down that fear of not being the world's best raconteur, or not thinking that you're funny, or all of that. It's about telling something that's meaningful to you, and if you tell it in that way, then people will like it.
Yes. Yeah, and it's meaningful to you. Again, this is sort of a sneak preview of what we'll talk about at the end, like how do you find stories? Anytime you have an experience or hear something from somebody that you're like, wow, cool or interesting, you've got a story there somehow. In the next, so the next point is to think about being intentional. Like, what about this story is interesting, surprising, lessons, etc. In what context could I use this story in? I'll give you a quick example. I was going for a walk with a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago who's also does career coaching, and she was sharing a story about how, oh, I don't know, it's like 20, 25 years ago, she worked in higher ed and wondered about doing career coaching and teaching, and wondering what it would be like to work in the private sector. And so it's really charming because she said, I decided to practice what I preach to my student clients and do an informational interview. And sometimes, it's a little challenging to practice what we preach. And so she does an informational interview with this man at a local, pretty good sized manufacturing company. And at the end of the informational interview, he said, we're about to post a position for a training and development director. Would you be interested in applying for it? And she ended up applying and getting it and working there. And I share that with my clients. It's what a great example of, you never know what'll happen when you have those conversations. And the more you have those conversations, like the more doors open to you. So simple little, like 2-minute story my friend shared with me.
I think that's a wonderful story, and I also am a big believer in that there's no wasted conversations. You never quite know where it will go, and I think it's an interesting point, because I think another thing that people have said to me is that I don't have any stories. I haven't got any stories to tell, and I think illustrating it with a short story like that shows that it doesn't have to be war and peace. It's an anecdote and something that illustrates a point. And I know when I've done research asking people to tell me stories, the minute you say to somebody, tell me a story, it's like they've forgotten how to speak. But actually, if you say, tell me about a time when something interesting happened at work, or, what did you know about this organization before you joined, is one of the questions I like to ask. You get story after story after story. So I think it's, if you in yourself are thinking, I don't have any stories to tell, reframe it in your mind and think, well, what have I got? What's interesting? What would I tell my friend about what happened to me at work? What have I learned since I joined? That sort of thing. That is where you can get the stories from.
Really good point. Yeah. Tell me about a time when, so it's like, yep, no, okay, now I have to perform. And, related to that, I think about, so one of the things that I'll do with client companies is, if they're trying to capture their culture through stories, or their values. Because you think about, if somebody says, we value teamwork, like, okay, what does that look and sound like in real life? Or we value being customer centric. Again, what does that look and sound like? Is one of the things that I recommend to client companies is, ask your employees two things. One is, when you think about what it's like to work here, what you like about what it's like to, we'll start with that, what it's like to work here, what are some things you've experienced that you're like, man, this is what makes this a great place to work? And then, or let's say values. So we talk about customer centricity is at the heart of who we are. What are some of the experiences you've had with customers where you really showed that loud and clear, or you've heard some of your peers share stories? So that, and then also, and I guess we are kind of moving into jumping ahead a little bit, but the how to be on the lookout for stories is, moving forward, please be on the lookout as you go through your day. When you have a moment of truth, maybe it's with your supervisor who gives you a big shout out in a team meeting saying, man, Susanne rocked it today when she did yada, yada, yada. And you're like, this is why I love working here. Working hard, going the extra miles, appreciate. So like situation like that, or maybe when, et cetera, to please be on the lookout for those little moments of truth. And then please like email me as soon as possible, and we'll do a quick conversation around it so we capture it while it's fresh in your mind. Because as I'm sure you've experienced, it's a lot easier to come up with stories prospectively, like moving forward now that you know to be on the lookout, than trying to like furrowed brow, like when was a time, do you know what I'm saying? Like, what would you like to say about that? Because that's,
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think the first thing is when you start on this kind of journey of wanting to use stories more in your work, it's starting to notice. So notice when you hear a story, notice when something happens that you think could be made into a story, and make a note of it in that moment. I cannot tell you the number of meetings I've sat in scribbling things in my notebook because something's happened that I thought would be interesting, and sometimes I'm quite furtive about doing it so nobody knows, but so they don't think I'm going to be writing about them. But it is about noticing that in the moment, make a note, and then start to build up like a bank of stories that you've got. So work on them, sort of finesse them, but then I think you don't want to make it sound like you're trotting out a speech, but it has to be, you have to be clear about the purpose of what it is you're telling and why. So I think it's useful to make a note of stories, create a little bank of stories that you can use, and come and revisit them, so that you remind yourself of them. And then that can make you feel more comfortable in the fact that you have stories. But the key for me is noticing stuff, noticing things that go on around you. When you're in a shop, or you're on holiday, or you're in the office, or anything, stuff can happen that you think, oh, this would be great, but you have to, well, I have to write it down, otherwise it will have gone by the time I actually think I have to use it. But with any practice, I think the first part is awareness and noticing.
neat. Boy, there are a couple of things that you said I want to play off of. Absolutely, the writing down. I think one of the absolute most important things a person can do if they want to use stories is to jot down just enough notes that you could look at it 6 months later, a year later, and tell that story. And so what I recommend to people do it, and we can send this to people later, um, just a simple 2-column story table, and each row is about a single story. Uh, I just do right cell is enough narrative, again, that I could tell that story by looking at that a year or more. And then the left cell is searchable keywords. So if I'm looking for stories on career change or courageous conversations or company culture, whatever, I can search through my list. So absolutely.
That's brilliant. I think it's but a lot of people don't do that, but I do think it's a notebook or have something like that. I mean, I love the idea that it's searchable, so that makes it so much more usable for you. But it does mean that you can remember things. There's a really cool website actually called storytest.com, which is run by a company called Anecdote, and if you go on it, they show you stories and you have to decide whether it's a story or not. And it's a really good way of honing your skills at spotting a story.
Oh, cool. And speaking of resources, I want to mention a couple, and then I want to go back to a couple things that you said here. Another fantastic resource is it probably is looks like it's reverse.
No, I can see
Can
it.
you
It's
see it?
good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. So Influencer, it's and it's by the people who wrote Crucial Conversations. It's one of my probably top 5 favorite business books. And anybody who wants to be a more compelling communicator, definitely recommend reading that. And in the early part, they lots of stories. And in the early part of the book, they tell this amazing story of what typically happens in organizations when leaders try to mobilize the troops, and why storytelling works a whole lot better. Um, and one of the takeaway messages from the book, and it kind of goes back to some of the stuff that you were saying earlier, Susanne, was I love this where they said, when you talked about relatability, They said, experience is the best teacher, as we all know. Vicarious experience is the second best. And that's one of the reasons why storytelling is so powerful, because it creates vicarious experience, as opposed to just like you using your prefrontal lobe and again, abstract thought. It's a full experience. But I want to comment on something you said. I'm looking at my notes here. When you said, we talked about writing down when at meetings, like somebody shares something, and it speaks to something you said earlier about people, um, like, oh, I don't know how to tell stories. Like, I can't do that. One of my friends is an amazing storyteller, just amazing. And when we first started getting together, I would write like notes as she's talking. And I think it was like the second time we got together, she's like, "What are you writing?" And I'm like, "Fran, you're amazing. The stories you tell are just amazing." And now she's used to it. But I thought I would share a story that she shared with me as a great example of maybe of a segue, help us segue into ways of using storytelling. And
Sounds
so
good.
so here's a great example of using a story to A, challenge somebody's limiting belief, B, help somebody shift their physiology from feeling like disempowered and I can't do this, to feeling, at least if not empowered, feeling curious and hopeful and interested. So here's the story.
Mm.
And it's actually an example of a story within a story. So uh, several years ago, I did a presentation for this college, and it was all for all staff. And when it was over, this young woman came up to me and she asked me for my advice about how to deal with a toxic team member. She's new supervisor, young supervisor, inherited a team, and one of her team members had been there like 20, 25 years, should have been fired 20, 25 years ago. and this woman on the team had never been confronted about her toxic behavior. And so she's asking me like, how can I have this conversation? Now, in the old days, I would have been like, oh, okay, she wants my advice. I will give her my advice. But I could see from her posture, her facial expression, her physiology, or I couldn't see her physiology, but her posture and facial um, expression, that her physiology was one of hopelessness and helplessness.
Mm.
So any kind of recommendation that I gave would just like bounce off. And, I think anybody viewing this who's a supervisor, leader, parent, coach,
Oh
whatever,
yeah.
spouse, friend, knows that, what that experience is like. And
Mm.
so I'm like, okay, there's no way she can hear about how to do something different than avoid it in this physiological and mental state. So I'm like, okay, story time. Like, what story could I use? I'm like, oh, Fran's story. So I said, it reminds me of a friend of mine who had a really toxic team member that she inherited. In fact, the owners of the company, when they hired her, said, one of the things that we want you to do is performance manage Mary out of the company. This should have happened years ago. They didn't have the courage to do it. So now they wanted Fran. And Fran's like, okay. But first she wants to give Mary a chance. So she does all the good stuff to give Mary a chance. Mary's still just sarcastic, angry, sniping, etc. So it's like, okay, we've got to have this conversation to free up her future. And so she invites Mary into, I don't know, her office conference room. And she says to Mary, like, Mary, how you doing? Mary's like, I'm fine. And Fran says something like, really? And Fran's this very jovial, like bright, cheery kind of personality. So she has a really great way of being able to be really straightforward without coming across as antagonistic. So she's like, really, Mary? Because like, you just don't seem happy here. In fact, I know we've talked about, several times when you said this, that, and I noticed again this morning you did such and such. Mary's like, well, and so they talk a little more, and Fran is talking about how this isn't really working out. And then suddenly Mary goes, wait, are you firing me? And Fran's like, yeah. And Mary goes, I can't believe it. I never could imagine getting fired would feel fun. And so I know. And they talk some more. And Fran goes, you know what, Mary? I can almost promise you in 6 months, I'll be getting a call from you and you're going to be happy because you found a job that works for you. And you know what? About 6 months goes by, Fran gets a call, and Mary isn't in a new job, but she finally went back to school to get a degree in what she had always wanted to be in. And she said, Fran, thank you for firing me. And so I shared that with this young supervisor, and I could just see, like her, her posture, her physiology shifting by how she was coming across. And now that she's in that more hopeful, kind of bemused and charmed by the story state, now she can hear what I'm going to say about how she might have that conversation. So that's a a great example of just paying attention to cool things people share with you. How could you use that? And then to our next topic about using stories. So one way is using stories to challenge somebody's limiting belief without being challenging and confrontational, and using stories to shift somebody from an I can't to an maybe I can state.
I
So
think there's two things from that I really love. I love the story. I think it's brilliant. And I love the sort of the end bit where she has the realization that she's being fired and doesn't mind. That I just think is wonderful, and a real shift. I can imagine for somebody hearing that story would really shift their behavior and their mindset. The other thing I really like about that story is a really good example of how to use someone else's story. So a question that I get asked a lot is, can I tell stories that haven't happened to me? And my response is always yes, but you have to let people know that it didn't happen to you. So the way that you did that is, let me tell you a story that a friend told me. And I think that makes it fine. I think and so it's a beautiful illustration of a story that you can use, but also how to purpose and repurpose a story that you've heard from somebody else's.
Neat. And I love that you mentioned the shift, because that's and maybe that's something we'll do in a future webinar, more of the technique side of it. One of the most useful patterns in a story that I've found over the years to help somebody break out of this fixed belief is to tell a story that they quote know is going to go in this direction, and suddenly, just like you say, there's a shift, like, whoa, didn't see that coming. And so making sure you tell the story so it seems obvious it's going in this direction, and that sudden shift of like, oh, in that sense of confusion and whoa, there's the opening for a new perspective because the person's a little disoriented. So yeah, I love that you mentioned the shift piece. What are some of go ahead.
Sorry, no, you go ahead.
I was just curious, what are some of the other ways that you use stories?
So for me, obviously, I work mostly in the organisation change space. And for me, it's a big part about communicating to people. So it's a bit like what you were saying about shifting behaviour, but it's also about communicating a future situation to people. So I worked in an organisation a while ago, a big government department, and they had a lot of change programmes going on all at the same time, and they weren't at all joined up. And so they, every day, people would get messages from each of the different programs about stuff that was happening. And I think there were dates in one program that crossed over and caused a conflict with the dates in the other program. And people didn't have a clear vision of what this future state was going to be like. And so the work that I was there to do was to try and knit all of that together. And so I decided to create a story to tell people what this new world would look like. So pulling together 7 different change programs into a consistent story about what somebody's day at work would look and feel like in the future. And using that in a story kind of way. So talking about what things used to be like and what things will be like now. And if you're customer facing, how the journey of the customer will be. Let's tell the story of how somebody, rings up a call center, say, and then what happens to them, and then when they finish the call, what happens then. If you try and put that into a story format rather than a load of facts and dates, people become much more engaged in it, and people are much clearer about what the future holds for them. And in change, that's really key. There's various models and various research out there to show that if people feel like they understand what's going to happen and they feel in control of it and they feel that people are listening to them, then that's part of the battle in pushing change over the line. And a story can really help with bring that to life.
Neat. Just writing a note, make me think of something. Yeah, I mean, just even hearing you say like the story of what a day in your life will look like. I mean, I found myself getting more interest, like, ooh, like what would that be like? And so I could imagine with the employees perking up versus, again, bullet points of, this, and that, here's our metrics, etc.
We use pictures as well. We didn't just use text, we used pictures. And actually, I think pictures are really powerful in storytelling. So people shouldn't feel constrained by just using words. I think it's really, really cool to use pictures sometimes too.
Good point. That actually makes me think of something that MD Anderson, which is a big cancer research and treatment center in the States. One of the things that they did, which I think is wonderful, that made a huge difference and turnover, was they had, back in the day, the sort of classic boring as watching paint dry, new hire orientation, where literally they had proctors going up and down the hall to wake up people. It was that literally boring. And one of the things they did to make their new hire orientation piece of onboarding inspiring is they had I think it's, I don't know, 3 to 5 minute video, a day in the life of a patient, and sharing the story of the interaction, that housekeeping and all the different quote ancillary roles play in the patient experience. And again, that visual just makes it so much more real in telling the story.
A client of mine did that recently, actually. So as part of their response to COVID, they are completely changing the way that people are expected to work. Home working is going to become normal, even when people can continue to work in the office. But they're also talking about working hours, and it's a complete shift for them. And they created a series of videos actually featuring real people in the organization. And they got them to talk about how their day used to be, and then how their day in the future would be in this new world. And then they created a cartoon version of each person living this kind of life in the past. And it was like grey, and they were really stressed, and all of that. And then in this new world, this little cartoon person's doing yoga in the afternoon and all this. But it made people laugh, but also it illustrated what this future state is going to look like in such a better way than if, going back to my story at the beginning, when somebody just standing up and saying, we're moving to this new model. It was so much more engaging, and people really talked about it. And then they started telling stories about these cartoons, and it's become this hugely important part of the culture.
Oh, that's neat. I'm thinking, I'm paying attention to our time here. It looks like we've got about, 10 more minutes, I think. There's one kind of loose end I'd like to tie up, and then to give another example of using storytelling in more of the corporate kind of context. So since the theme of this is like how to use stories to facilitate change, one of the most useful stories types of, I'll give you two types of stories, both at an individual level and at a team level or workforce level. When you think about people who are facing a change, they're, oftentimes the mindset is, I can't. And back to the mind body connection, their physiology, their emotional slash physiological state makes it literally impossible for them mentally to see opportunities, to see possibilities. Because again, and just anybody thinking about when you're really tired, you don't feel well, you don't see solutions to problems like you do after you've had a good night's sleep and you feel great. And so two types of stories, and maybe this will be for another day, we can give examples, or maybe I'll give one short one that I recommend people doing is share the, hey, if I could handle that, I can handle this, or hey, we handle that, we can handle this stories. So asking people to come up with examples from their life. So for me, I won't tell the story, but for me, one of those is how as a painfully shy with horrible self-esteem college students, I spent a summer selling books door to door to put myself through college.
Wow.
I'm like, if I can handle that, I can handle just about anything. And then the other type of story is what I call, and maybe I will share this story. Um, what I call the, if I didn't think I could, but I did story. And a quick, simple example, and if there's one, if you have, I don't want to put you on the spot, but after I tell mine, if there's one that comes up for you, that'd be cool to share. Um, that one that oftentimes I'll share with clients is about 10 years ago, I reached out to a nonprofit organization who deals with cancer survivors and offered to put together a fundraiser for them. Said, I'll do a talk on resilience and I'll pull together some speaker friend colleagues on related topics. And she's like, fantastic, that'd be awesome. And then she says, would you mind being the MC? And my inner voice is like, no, because even though a lot of what I've done for the last many years is public speak, I'm an introvert by nature. And I've always thought of MCs as being like schmoozy extroverts, all that. And I'm not a chit chatty, schmoozy kind of guy. So, but I'm thinking like, hey, you're the one who suggested doing this program. She clearly doesn't want to do it. And I could tell she was more of an introvert than me. And I'm like, put your big boy pants on, suck it up and say you'll do it. I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. So, you know, months go on, now it's weeks, and I'm practicing my talk and I'm psyching myself up to be the MC. We have the event, awesome audience, they're really into the topics. I do my MC thing, do my talk, and at the end, one of my friends who was there said, so what do you think? I said, I think it went really well. They seem to be really into it, and I had a good time. And she goes, anything, like any big takeaways that hit you? So I'm like, let me think. And then I'm like, oh man. I said, do you remember in my talk when I talked about how important it is to recognize self-limiting beliefs and realize that we're just like hypnotizing ourselves into believing that it's not necessarily true? And she's like, yeah, that's, good reminder. I said, it just hit me. All these years, I've been telling myself, I don't have what it takes to be an MC. And not only was I able to do it, and people said I did a good job, but I actually enjoyed it. And now I'm thinking, all these years you've been telling yourself you can't do this, but you can. What else have you been convincing yourself you can't do, but you can? So that's an example of that. So if you share yours, like with a client or with a group, then ask them, like, what's something that you surprised yourself you were able to do? They can, as they're telling their story, that starts to shift their state so they can start, quote, thinking outside the box. So I'm curious, do you have a, didn't think I could, but I did, or
Oh,
if I can handle that, I can handle this story?
yeah, and I think there's a couple of things that struck me while you were telling your story. One is, again, it's a wonderful story, but also it's another set of stories, isn't it? So we tell ourselves stories in our own head. And so much of the work as a coach, which we both do, is challenging those stories and asking the question, is that true? And then I do that work on myself all the time, and my coach has done the same to me when I've started talking about something. And it reminded me of a situation a few years ago. So I've got a friend who is an amazing sportswoman. She's represented Britain in triathlon. She's rowed for Great Britain. She's very, very sporty, and I am not. And so that's fine. But I'd always thought, oh, I could, I'd love to do something like she does, but I never could. And for her 50th birthday a few years ago, she said to me, she knows I love to swim, and she said, I'd really like to do like a long distance open water swim with you for my birthday. I don't want to have a party. I just want to do this with you because I know you really like swimming. I know you like open water swimming. What do you reckon? And I just said, yeah, that would be great, because that's kind of my response to most things. Yeah, that'd be brilliant. How far is this thing? And she went, oh, it's 10 kilometers, so 6 miles. And I was like, oh, okay. And to begin with, I was really excited, and I did loads of training, and I was really thrilled, and I got my swimming hat came in the post, and I was like, oh, this is amazing. And then a few weeks before, the little voice in my head started to tell me, you can't do this. This is too much. You're going to come last. That's always my fear in these things. I'm going to be last. And my friend is going to finish ages before you. You're going to make a fool of yourself. Blah, blah, blah. All the kind of stories in my head. And for a few weeks, I actually stopped training, which is so counterproductive. But because I couldn't see how I was going to be able to do it. But then I thought, well, I can't let her down. It's her birthday, and this is all she wants to do, and we've done all this training. So I got back on it again, and I did it, and I managed to do it, and I didn't come last, and she finished before me, but that was okay, and I actually quite enjoyed it. And so, similar to you, afterwards, as well as being exhausted, I had this real feeling of exhilaration that I had done something, first of all, that not many people have done. And secondly, I didn't think I could do. And even now, when I look back on it, I can't quite believe that I did. But it gives me that same feeling of challenging the story that I was telling myself, and challenging that really counterproductive sort of self-sabotage that was going on near the end. So when I catch myself doing that again, I can refer back to that story and say, well, it didn't help you, but you still managed to do it. So come on, get on with it.
That's awesome. And boy, what a great example of like why tell stories. It's like as you're telling your story, I'm like, okay, what happened next? And especially, and I'm glad you mentioned the stories you're telling yourself, because that's also one of the reasons why I'm such a fan of telling personal stories. Obviously, always want to think is this like TMI, appropriate story, boundaries, all that. That's hopefully self-evident to people. But sharing personal experiences and my internal process, because it really helps the listener understand their internal process. So what a cool story, like to use as a great example of a story a coach can use with somebody to help that person, like, oh, like what are the limiting stories I'm telling about myself? And when you talked about stop training, even though that was obviously like that wasn't a good idea,
Oh, it didn't
and
help.
how we do, yeah, it didn't help, and how we do that stuff. And you think about if I'm your client and I'm like, oh, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And is she going to, get on my case about it? You share a story like that, I become more bonded to you. You have more credibility, and I'm able to look at myself and what I'm doing. So what an awesome story.
Yes, it was quite an experience. I'm not sure I'd do it again, but it was quite an experience. I definitely learned a lot.
That's cool. So what about as we start to wind up? So in terms of being on the lookout, we talked about just paying attention, being present day to day. And it kind of reminds me, I think it was the poet Keats who said, poetry makes all of life interesting. I'm not sure that's verbatim, but pretty close to verbatim. And that's what I think about storytelling, because once like stories are everywhere, they're just the interesting experiences. I think it also helps us with mindfulness and being present, because you're much more likely to pick up stories. So we talked about things that surprise you, that are funny, that somebody tells you that are inspiring, writing down. We talked about the little 2-column table. Any other thoughts before we start to wind up about that can help people realize you already do this and here's how to bring more intentionality to it, etc.?
I think it's noticing when something piques your interest. So going back to your story about the speaker and how everyone was bored until they started to tell a story. I think it's having that level of self-awareness that when you're in a meeting or you're on a Zoom call or you're in a conversation with somebody, and you first of all notice your attention wanders, and then you notice what brings you back. And I think that's to develop that ability to be really actively listening and to be paying attention, is what's most important. I was watching the film Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood over Christmas, which Fred Rogers, for us in the UK, is not somebody that we know. So he was a new character for me. But what I loved in the film, and I've never watched any of the real programs, so I don't know whether this is how he was in real life, but the attention that he paid to every person who spoke to him, as though they were the most important person in the room, was amazing to me, and a really beautiful example of paying beautiful attention. I think it's Nancy Klein who calls it that. And for me, that's what's made a difference for me in noticing what's going on around me, is trying to pay attention and noticing when my attention wavers and then trying to bring it back. That is the start of all of this for people, is that attention to people, paying attention.
I love it. I love it. And so what's the best way for people to reach out to you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, so look me up. It's Susanne Evans, Susanne with an S, not a Z or a Z. And my website is Feldspar Consulting. I also have a podcast called Change Stories, which you mentioned at the beginning, and that's all stories. It's people telling their stories about their life and their work. So yeah, get in touch, connect. It would be great.
Fantastic. And for those who want to reach out to me, obviously LinkedIn too. David, there's probably a million David Lees. And if you put in David Lee and then Maine, USA, you'll find me. And Human Nature at Work is one of my websites. That's maybe the easiest one. If you want, I've got a storytelling website, but it's a little out of date. Well, actually, Human Nature at Work is a little out of date too. I'm in the process of upgrading it. But anyway, you can reach out to me, David at humannatureatwork.com, and I can send you some recordings from other talks on storytelling. So thank you so much. This has been super fun.
It certainly has. And as ever, it's always good to have a chat with you about stories.
Likewise. So I'll edit this part out. Actually, I can just go ahead and stop.